Hello, everyone, and welcome to artifact number one of module number one, an introduction to art history that I call form versus context. To put it very simply, and we'll jump into this image in just a moment, the word form involves exactly what it is we see in a work of art, and context involves what that form means. So maybe to put it in a slightly more elementary way, form is what we see, context is what that means. And as a group of students who likely have very little experience with art history, but who have a whole lot of experience in looking at things, you're probably very good at form, or you should be. If I were to ask you what you see, you can probably do that with great ease. If I were to ask you what all of that means, context might be a little bit more challenging. But our artifact today is meant to primarily give you experience in thinking about how the things we see might have meaning that we don't at first understand. And in order to jump on into this, I want to show you a map of what Northern Europe looks like today. Now, 600 years ago, Northern Europe looked a little bit different, and there were countries and appellations that existed back then that no longer do today. But this will give us a great place to start. This area here, sort of highlighted, is the modern country of Belgium. Now, Belgium is a relatively new word in the early part of the Renaissance. This part of what is northeastern France was then called Flanders. And to be perfectly honest, Belgium now, which is tiny by most standards, is a pretty complicated place. Around Brussels here, and in the southern part of Belgium, all throughout here, the common language is French. But in the northern part, places like Bruges, you can see, Ghent, and Antwerp, the traditional language is Flemish, which is kind of an interesting hodgepodge between Dutch and German. So this country, which is, wait for it, 1/4 of the size of Iowa, has two official languages, both French and Flemish. Now, the artist whose work we're looking at here, his name is Jan van Eyck, and Van Eyck is from primarily the town of Bruges up here. Bruges is a fantastic place. You absolutely should go and visit. Um, and this work was done in 1434 in what we call the early Northern Renaissance. So let's talk about those three words, early, Northern, and Renaissance. The northern part for art historians, at least as it pertains to the Renaissance, merely means it happened north of Italy. The early part means it is this interesting transitional moment between the late medieval world, which Van Eyck is kind of a part of in terms of being able to see it in his recent rearview mirror, and then the full cultural explosion of the Renaissance that will exist in about 60 years later in his from this painting. And so early Northern Renaissance is this period that sort of roughly translates to say 1400 to 1470, give or take. The painting you're looking at, so-called the Arnolfini portrait, is a relatively small work of art currently owned by the National Gallery of Art in London. Oh golly, its size is probably 30 by 25. It's small enough to where you could probably put it into your jacket and walk out of the museum with it. You shouldn't do that, don't steal, but it's a pretty small work of art despite its ambitious subject matter, which is a full-length double portrait. Now, when I teach this painting on the first day of class, and I've been doing this for, well, I guess just about 20 years, I often put it up and I ask students a very simple question and one that all of you can do now. And I ask them, what do you see? And I ask you to think about it not as it pertains to adjectives, but only nouns. What do you see in terms of adjectives, nouns, and not adjectives? So a noun, if you want to kick it back in third grade grammar, is a person, place, thing, event, or an idea. And an adjective is a word or words that describes them. So on my end, I am, I suppose, a man. But beyond that, we can put in all kinds of words that further describe my manliness, right? I could be a blue-eyed man, a balding man, a white man, an art historian man. Those all describe my manliness. So for the sake of all of this, I want to remove adjectives and think only about nouns. And so let's take a look at this. On the right-hand side of the composition, uh, let's strike that. On the left-hand side of the composition, we have a man. And we can describe that man, and we will in a second, but for the time being, let's just call him a man. He's standing, and his name is Giovanni Arnolfini. Man, there's a detail. We'll come back to this in a second. On the right-hand side of the composition, we have a woman. There are their hands. We can think that in the lower part of the composition here and in the background over here, we have shoes. In the center of the composition, there he is, woof, we have a dog. In the background over here, we have a hand broom. I'll say more about this in a second. This standing figure with their arms clasped there, and something around their head there. And then a wild Netherlandish mythical beastie here. On the back wall and the ceiling, we have a mirror, a chandelier with a single candle. We have some writing painted here on the wall, and we have some prayer beads. And along the side of the painting, not far from the window here, you can see that we have some oranges. Now, this might seem a silly thing to say, but it's one of the most brilliant things a professor of mine told me when I was in graduate school. Nothing is in a painting by accident. And so what I want to do is now move away from strict form to now describing the form. And then from there, we will transition into what these things mean. Because this painting might have a sense of meaning that at first we don't understand. So a way to think about that, let's go to Giovanni Arnolfini, and let's think about how we might describe him. First of all, let's think about his name, Giovanni. Giovanni is not a Netherlandish or Flemish name. It is an Italian name. Giovanni is Italian for John. And so this man is an Italian man working in Bruges in the middle third of the 15th century as a banking agent for a remarkably wealthy Florentine family called the Medici. And we'll talk more about the Medici when we speak about the early and the high Renaissance in Italy. So he's a banking agent. And if we were to think about him, there's all kinds of words we could use to describe him. To begin with, let's think about him as it pertains to class or wealth. He's wearing a fur-lined cloak. He's wearing extravagant clothing. He has on silk stockings. He has on a super cool hat. And if we were to think about his complexion is remarkably pale. Now, what pale skin means in our world is something very different than what it meant during his world, and we'll say something more about that in a moment. For the time being, I think it's safe to say that this is a man of extravagant wealth. The woman he stands next to, her name is, wait for it, Giovanna. She also is Italian, and she is wearing this really fantastic bright green dress that has so much fabric around it that she has gathered it up around her midsection and she holds it in place. This clothing also suggests her wealth. She has on a gold necklace or gold necklaces, and you can see them here. Her hair has been put up, has been covered with a white veil as a sign of modesty. And as women did during the 15th and 16th century, her forehead has been plucked to give her a nice, big, tall hairline. Now, one of the things you'll learn in this class is sometimes people did 100 or 200 years ago seems really bizarre to us. For example, I bet none of the young ladies in this class pluck their foreheads in order to give themselves a super high hairline, but you do shape your eyebrows. And that's something that 400 years from now, people will scoff at too. So although it seems unusual to us that women might do this, it was certainly the cultural practice for the wealthy and socially elite of their own day. The green of this garment, this rich, vibrant green, also suggests the wealth of these people. And at first, we might not pay much attention. Let's think about their hands. Giovanni has raised up his left hand in this kind of gesture. And what's interesting about this gesture is that we see it again and again during this time frame by artists who depict the baby Jesus, or even the grown-up Jesus for that matter. It is this gesture of blessing. I mean, I was brought up and raised in the Catholic tradition, and 5 times a mass, a priest was raise his hand like this and saying "In nomine Patri and Filii and Spiritus Sancti" as a way of blessing the congregation. So he has raised his hand as a way to almost provide a blessing. You can see he has on what looks to be an onyx bracelet around his wrist, another one over here, and you can see that they're both wearing jewelry. She has a ring on this hand. He's wearing a ring on this finger. She has on a bracelet. All of these suggest a kind of wealth. As a matter of fact, this is an image that we'll look at in a few weeks' time. This is an example of a very traditional Netherlandish wedding portrait from around the middle part of the 15th century, so about the same time frame. So if you think about it, their hand gestures are different, I grant you, but please note how she has gathered her dress up around her midsection. This is the way in which wedding portraits traditionally looked in what is now modern-day Belgium around the year 1430 to 1450. Now, if you were to think that she looks like she might be pregnant, I would ask you, would she have been shown that way if she were being married? And the answer is no. She might have been pregnant, but she wouldn't have been shown that way. And there's a distinction there that I'll come back to in a little while. We've already talked about the shoes being present, but we didn't talk about why they're there. And so their shoes have been removed. You can see he is in his stocking feet, presumably having taken them off. We can't see her toesies, but she's probably not wearing any shoes. Here they are back there. And when I teach this in a traditional class, I usually ask students, why have they taken off their shoes? And students often reply, they're inside. And indeed they are. And I'm inside right now too. And I bet you are as well. But you have your shoes on. And so it's not simply that they're inside, they take off their shoes. I wear my shoes inside all the time. There's actually another reason why their shoes have been taken off. And the taking off of shoes in a certain kind of context has a rich tradition that transcends Europe, Flanders, and even the Western religion. So if you are familiar with the Jewish Bible, when Moses is before the burning bush, he takes off his shoes before God. When Muslims enter a mosque, they remove their shoes as a sign of respect for God. If you ever go into a Japanese tea house, you remove your shoes as a demonstration of your purity. So sometimes we remove our shoes as a sign of respect or because we might be on holy ground. And I would suggest to you that they have removed their shoes for a reason such as this. You might be wondering, why is there a dog? And I suppose there could be two dogs, or two reasons why there's a dog there. One, maybe they owned a dog. I mean, I got a dog. It's a 110-pound Great Dane. He wouldn't fit in this painting, but I have a dog. Maybe they had a dog. I don't know. But what I can tell you is that dogs traditionally appeared in Netherlandish wedding portraits. And the reason might surprise you. So I ask you to think about what might be a really lame name for a dog. I'll give you a couple. Rover, lame name for a dog. Spot, lame name for a dog. But how about this one? Fido. Fido. Fido, it was a traditional name for a dog, and Fido comes from the Latin word fidelis. And from that word, we get the word fidelity. And the word fidelity essentially means faithfulness. And if you were to think about words you want to describe a romantic relationship very broadly, or your marriage more specifically, faithfulness would be one of those. And so dogs frequently appear in wedding portraits as a way of symbolizing marital fidelity. In the back of this composition, you can see that we have three things back here. One is a little hand broom. This is a wild Netherlandish beastie. And this looks to be a carved standing human figure with their hands brought together in prayer and what looks to be a halo around their head. So let's think about at least two of these. Right now, we live in a very different world than the world in which my grandma Clark and my grandma Zygmunt lived, neither of whom went to college. And I'm trying to think, my mother was born in 1949. I think my grandma Clark would have graduated from high school, oh golly, maybe like 1939. And I can guarantee you that few of her female high school classmates went on to college or university. Their jobs, primarily, even in the 20th century, involve two distinct roles: domestic life, and that is caring for a home, and marital life, caring for a family. So this dust broom here, this little hand broom, symbolizes her domestic role as that of a housekeeper. You don't know this because you haven't taken an art history class yet, but in the 15th century, in the northern part of Europe, particularly in parts of Flanders, on their headboard, women often placed a statue of Saint Margaret. Why Saint Margaret? Well, Saint Margaret was the patron saint of childbirth. And so in this little part of the composition here, we have symbolic references to Giovanna's primary goals as a woman, that of housekeeper and that as mother or mother-to-be. I mean, this person is standing, hands brought together in a very traditional sign of prayer. The spot around her head is clearly a halo as it goes back to the early Christian arts when they steal the idea from Greek depictions of Apollo. And because of where it's placed, we know it's St. Margaret. So these are all representations of domestic life or that of childbearing. I mentioned to you the three things back here. We have mirror, we have chandelier, we have writing. Here's that chandelier. And how many candles are lit in that chandelier? Let's count them up. One. Do you think that candle illuminates the interior space? And the answer is no. That candle here does not illuminate the interior space. What does illuminate the interior space? This thing right here. That's called a window. And outside that window is a gigantic celestial orb called the sun. The sun lights up this room, not that candle, and yet the candle is lit. And the reason why might surprise you. So, in order to understand this, I'll tell you a story. I began my job at my last job before I became the associate dean at Louisiana Tech at a school then called Clark College in Dubuque, Iowa. Clark was run by a group of super cool and sassy Catholic nuns, and Clark College nearly burnt to the ground in 1984. So I think it's safe to say that Clark College, now Clark University, was deathly afraid of fire. And the classroom where I taught this very material, and I usually taught this class at 11:30 or 11 o'clock to 12:30. At the end of class, students would walk out the classroom, make a left-hand turn, and walk straight. And they would walk right by the chapel. And if they looked into the chapel, the open chapel, they would see one single candle lit. A candle lit in a school that nearly burnt to the ground. And the reason why that candle was there and was always there was because it symbolized the presence of the Holy Spirit. So this is clearly not meant to light that room. Instead, it symbolizes the presence of the Holy Spirit. In what I think is one of the all-time great passages in the history of Western art is this mirror on the back part of the wall. And to give you an idea of scale, this object here, this mirror, is about 3 inches across. It's about the size of a coffee cup. And in that coffee cup, Van Eyck has painted Giovanni, Giovanna, and then 2 people we cannot see in this part of the painting, but we know that they're there because we see them in this part of the painting. There's a person there in red and a person there in blue. So if they're here, but not here, where are they? And the answer is so obvious and intuitive. You might actually struggle. They're not here in the composition. They're in our space. We are them. They are there. Here they are. We can't see them because we are them. And if you think about it, what do you need to get married? And um, and inevitably, you might think, well, you need a priest. And the answer is no. You don't need a priest to get married. You might need a priest to get married in a church, but the state of Louisiana does not require that a priest be present. As a matter of fact, in many parts of the world, a marriage is both a religious affair and a civic affair. You can tell the state of Louisiana that a priest married you, but until a judge signs a piece of paper, it don't matter. And so this is not a priest, and this is not a court official. These are 2 witnesses. And to this day, don't you need witnesses? Right? And so if this is a wedding portrait, we have the groom, the bride, and 2 witnesses. And to give you an idea, these little round spots around the mirror, which are scenes taken from the Passion of Christ's last days, you can see here is a little crucifixion with Jesus, Mary, and St. John. That's about the size of a dime. I pause here to let you feel wonderment. It's the size of a dime, and on that dime, in oil paint, he has painted 3 figures. It's pretty remarkable. Between the chandelier and the mirror, we have this. It's a little calligraphic squiggle here, and then some writing in Latin, Johannes die Eyck für Eyck. Johannes die Eyck is Jan van Eyck in Latin. Now, it's important to note that up until, golly, the middle part of the 20th century, Most students learned Latin. It was the lingua franca of its day. The educated elite all around the world read Latin. You didn't really speak Latin unless you were a priest, but everyone could write in Latin. I'll give you a good example of this. Sir Isaac Newton, you might have heard of him, famous British mathematician and astronomer. When he wrote the Principia Mathematica in 1666, he did so in Latin, and not because he was Latin. Latin doesn't even exist. Like, he's English. But by writing in Latin, he could communicate with all of the mathematicians in Europe. So in writing this in Latin, the art maker himself is signifying his level of education. So let's translate this. Johannes die Eyck für Heck quite literally means Jan van Eyck was here. Jan van Eyck was here. Now, art makers will frequently sign their paintings, made this, or drew this, or sculpted this in Latin. And that would be pinks it, delinit, or sculpts it. That is how you would write in Latin that Jan van Eyck made this. Johannes die Eyck pinks it, or delinit. Instead, what Van Eyck has suggested is that he was there. And think about where we see that kind of writing, where we see Bob was here. And there's a couple places. One of them is graffiti in bathroom stalls, I suppose. It's not that you were doing something, it's like you were there. And by writing that he was there, he's almost symbolizing his presence. And not at a place, but during an event. And again, the idea that this might be a wedding picture. Finally, we might think about the oranges and why there might be oranges there. And I did not bring you, I don't have a bigger version of Google Maps. I only brought a little one, but here is where they're from. And I can tell you, having been to Belgium twice, and I love Belgium. Belgium is not the sunniest place I've ever seen. And if we were to zoom out, there are two places where oranges grow, because oranges need two things to grow primarily. They need water and sunshine. And oranges in Europe are primarily grown in Spain. And to give you an idea, Spain is over here, and in Greece. And Greece is so far away to the south and to the east that I can't even use my cursor to indicate it where it could be. So these oranges are not from there. They're from 2,000 miles that way and 2,000 miles this way. And one of the great truths of economics is the further something comes, the more expensive it is. I mean, you got to get that orange from the sunny place to the not sunny place, and that makes it more expensive. And so in having those here along the wall suggests, again, their wealth. It also does some symbolic work, right? Because fruit is often a sign of motherhood or children. Like fruit often gets us things, indicates fertility. So when art historians have looked at this composition, a lot of subtle whispers in the back of their head suggests that it is a kind of wedding portrait. We have them wearing very nice clothes, holding hands in a way that was traditionally depicting wedding portraits. Her hair is covered as a sign of modesty, as if she were in church. We have their shoes being taken off as if they're in holy ground. We have a single candle in the chandelier, which symbolizes the Holy Spirit. We have the dog, the symbol of marital fidelity. We have Jan van Eyck writing as if he is watching something or being there. So let's go with that idea. And I think it's a really good one, right? If someone asked me, what do you think this painting means? I'd say it's probably a wedding portrait. So now let me ask you a question, and I'm going to ask you a very specific question. If this is a wedding portrait, Do you think Giovanna Arnolfini would have been shown pregnant? Because when you looked at this image for the first time, you might have thought, huh, she looks pregnant. And the question I asked you was a very specific one. The question I asked was, would she have been shown pregnant? And the answer to this question gets us into a very important idea. And that important idea is the relationship between artist and patron. The artist is the person who makes the thing. The patron is the person who pays for it. And I'll give you another word that is important. It's not just paid for it, it's commissioned it. Now, I have sort of like right now at my desk, I have my fancy, way too expensive, but keeps my coffee hot for a long time Yeti coffee cup. I bought it. But what I did is I went to the Yeti store and bought it. And that's different than going to the Yeti store and saying, I want you to make me something. This wasn't just bought, right? Giovanni didn't go to Jan van Eyck's painting studio and buy a painting that already existed. He went to him with a bucket load of cash and said, I want you to paint this for me. So that's the difference between buying a work of art and commissioning a work of art. A patron commissions a work of art. And the relationship, if you think about it, who has the power in that relationship? Who has the power in the relationship between art maker and patron? And inevitably, when I teach this to students at a university, I'll have an artist in there and I'll ask the artist, okay, I want you to paint my head. How much will you charge me? And let's say they give me a number and they say $500. I said, excellent, $500. I would like you to paint me like, and I'm 6'1", 175 pounds. But what I would really like to be is 6'3", 210 pounds, but with no body fat. So the last time I did this, the art maker's name was Chase. And so I said, Chase, so $500, I got it. Will you paint me 6'3" and 210? He said, yep. I was like, I have kind of small squinty eyes. Will you paint me with bigger eyes? Sure. What about an upper lip? I don't really have an upper lip. Will you paint me with an upper lip? I'd really like to have one. Yeah, sure. And the reason why he'll do all of those things is he wants the thing that I've got, which is $500. Traditionally, not always, but for a long time, the relationship of power between artist and patron always rested with the patron, because the artist has the money that I, as the patron, have. So let's go with this idea that the patron has all of the money. Let's go, well, the patron has all the money. He has all the power. So let's go back to the question I asked. Would Van Eyck ever have painted Giovanna as if she were pregnant? And again, that's a different question than would he have painted her pregnant? It's 2000 and something or other right now, right? And many parts of the world look at premarital sex in a different kind of way than they did 500 years ago. Not everywhere, but most places. And what I mean to suggest is premarital sex now might get you ostracized, but it doesn't get you stoned to death, which it used to. So imagine 1434. Certainly, having marital relations outside of the sanctity of marriage was frowned upon, but I can promise you that it still existed. But let's say that it had existed in this relationship, and let's say they're not married yet, and let's say she is in fact married, or pregnant. Would she ever have been shown that way, knowing what people would have thought about both of them if it had been true? And the answer is no, because Giovanni would have gone to Jan van Eyck and said, hey, we're getting married. I know she's 8 months pregnant. Will you paint her as if she's not? And Arnold or Van Eyck would have said, well, of course, I'll paint her however you want. And so, is she pregnant? I don't know. Would she have been shown that way? Never. And so this traditionally has been shown as if it's a wedding portrait. And rather than being shown pregnant, she's shown as if she has the ability to do so. Because don't forget, part of her job is this thing right here, is the ability to have children. And so art historians traditionally have believed that this is a wedding portrait between two members of a prominent Italian society working in the North during the middle part of the 15th century, and that she has been shown as if she could become pregnant rather than that she actually is. There's something I forgot to mention, and let me go back to it now. I think we can agree that both she and her scary alien husband, he, have been shown remarkably pale. Let's talk about this cultural difference now, because when you and I, or when people today think about pale people, they think they probably need to go outside and get a bit more sun, that they look sickly. But 600 years ago, people who were pale were assumed to be wealthy. And the reason for this is simple. People who were outside working were tan. People who were inside and didn't have to work or did a desk job were not. And so today we now think of a tan skin as being markers of health. But 500 years ago, being tan was the sign of being a poor working class person. So all of these ideas eventually get us to elements of their wealth, clothing, hair, all the things around all of it. And as a kid who loved the Muppet Show, I give you Kermit and Miss Piggy. In a lot of ways, this demonstration shows the ways in which art historians are able to construct meaning by analyzing, exploring, and deconstructing the form that we see. If this were a traditional class, our interactions would often begin with me asking you what you see. And because most of you are gifted with the sense of sight, everyone would be able to contribute to that. But it's through an analysis of that form, of that things that we see, that we're able to get to the history part, the meaning part that art history is really about. That's what we'll talk about in the course of this class, both what we see and what that means. That wraps up Artifact 1 of module number 1. Many thanks for your kind attention.